Yes.
We'll try and उसको minimize भी कर दो.
Try and we'll begin now.
Yeah.
Give me what? This nice and that's what you sent to us.
And this is
Oh
no, I'll do it.
thank you. Yeah.
Cool.
Hi everyone, welcome to ALS. What? Yeah. That's okay? Is that bothering you?
No. Just it was in the middle.
Okay. Welcome to ALS. Alternative Law Forum is very critical law in space. We have a team of educators, we have a team of researchers, and a lot of us are involved in multiple advocacy initiatives with different spaces in Bangalore, connecting community-based organizations and human rights-based organizations in Bangalore. We have something called Friday Forum almost on a we try to do it on a weekly basis. And we host people who want to present their research work, people who want to screen their films, people who want to perform, and people who want to just start a discussion about either a working draft or a working paper. So today we have Ishita and Siddharth with us, and we both of them are doing their research PhD. And they're presenting to us today a paper. The link to the paper has been uploaded on our Twitter and Facebook. If you want the link to the paper after the discussion, get in touch. They're looking at the fishing industry, the marine industry in Goa, and they're looking at how a lot of these workers migrated from forest economies, or more so from forest areas. So they're looking at what does that migration mean? What does that relationship between their forest economy and coastal economy mean? And how does their work play out in their work in Goa? So what are the different social conditions? What are the material conditions of both the coast and the forest? So
what do you mean by material conditions?
We'll go through it. That's the presentation.
Whoa, that's a very hectic point to start from.
I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks a lot. We're both anticipating the conversation and very excited about presenting it. We've been working on this paper for quite a while now, actually. And in many ways, the paper's been an exploration, which has made us really kind of challenge ourselves, because it's made us have become familiar with literature that we weren't familiar with. We've had to kind of move through different disciplines, through different kinds of conversations, talk about different geographies. And I think, and we hope that, and in many ways, it's been an exploration and a way in which we've been learning as well. And I hope that this conversation also kind of follows the same spirit. And we hope to be able to have a conversation with you all. We will go through the paper, present some of the main things that came up, and then we'll open it up to discussion. The papers also coming from, so both of us are doing our PhDs right now, but our PhDs are on entirely different things. It has nothing to do with this paper. Part of the reason this paper began was because of conversations we've been having also about the question of labor in the fishing industry, which we've worked with in different times in different kinds of work. So the paper actually started in 2021. Siddharth was in Goa and I was in London at that point of time. Siddharth was involved with the repatriation of workers who got caught during the pandemic, and he'll tell us a little more about it. The paper started not to turn into an academic paper, but as we started looking into this question of Adivasi workers in Goa, we realized that there were actually more questions than there were answers, and that's kind of where the journey of this paper started from. Do you want to tell?
Yeah, sure.
About, yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So, yeah, I mean, as Ishita said, the paper actually started from relief work, and the paper is actually written from reflections on that. So 4 years ago to the date actually is when these incidents kind of transpired. So Goa has a fishing industry that's, compared to the size of the state, quite significant, and we'll go into that in a little bit more. Maybe it's here. Um, and so in 2020, when the lockdown was announced at the end of March, it played out in the fishing industry quite differently to some of the other places. So, the lockdown was announced and most of the fishing boats are not at harbors. They kind of keep coming in over the days as they catch fish and come back. And so there was like this delayed kind of impact of it where suddenly docksides were empty, trucks had stopped because they're on the land side, they had got lockdown measures, but the boats kept coming. And eventually, after 7, 8 days of this chaos, the harbors kind of settled into a complete lockdown phase where a lot of the workers who normally are not at the harbor were suddenly in the harbor. So fishing works where boats are at sea. Let's say there's 500 boats, 50, 60 of them on any given day will be in the harbor, and then the rest will be out. And then suddenly what started happening was that the harbor was filled with about 500 boats. And that means a few thousand workers suddenly at the harbor. It was a hugely crowded space. And there was chaos. So the initial work was just like getting food to people, trying to figure out what people needed. And then interestingly, just like with agriculture, the lockdown on fisheries was lifted. And so these boats went out fishing again. And in a lot of other places, so Karnataka, for example, Kerala, Maharashtra, Gujarat, the East Coast already had tapered down because they have their ban period. But the West Coast, all the other places, fishing didn't resume. It was particularly in Goa that this whole scale kind of fishing started. And so then the work became a lot about like, who's going fishing? What do they need during this fishing time? And interestingly, there were some groups of people who didn't want to stay in Goa. And most of them turned out to be traditional fishers from Andhra Pradesh who were also working in Goa. They did like net mending or they worked on some boats. And, there was 2 boats of people that left. A week later, 11 people took a flight and went home. And, we were involved in it. But somehow there was this recognition that Adivasi people were working in Goa in big numbers. So that was the first observation. And the second was that they were not going home. And so they continued fishing. And then when the monsoon starts, the fishing industry usually shuts down in the beginning of June. And what happened by then was that the Shramik trains, which had been running through most of May, kind of had stopped.
Can you please elucidate on what is Shramik train?
Shramik trains.
Shramik trains were the labor-specific trains that had been started by the government of India in response to a Supreme Court order to start repatriating workers who were walking back home, etc. So these trains, most of the workers had left, Goa was empty, and suddenly the fishing ends, and again there's a few thousand people on the streets. They don't have an accommodation, so they're being dropped off suddenly in like these relief shelters. And there was chaos. But anyway, so the relief work was then about that, which is like, how do we get people home? Because most of them were Adivasi and they were coming from areas which were across different states. So Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha, some from West Bengal. And suddenly there was no single destination to get home. So then it was going to district collectors, district magistrates, like talking about how do you get permits for people to get onto a train that's not going back to that area? Because if you remember from the lockdown, you could only go state to state. Crossing state borders, traveling by road required a whole kind of like permit system. So then it became clear that also there's like these cross-state identities of people where they are coming from. And that was the relief work. It happened. Some people didn't make it. So, there were deaths of people that happened. So at least 6 people died during this period. Some of them died because they had finished their fishing season, had nowhere to go. Their dead bodies were discovered overnight in the rain. There was an incident of one of the Adivasi people being tied on a chain by the local Goan villagers because they found him to be creating a nuisance. And then they just let him go next day by he was literally in high chain. So then there was also this thing about what is happening. There clearly is a group of Adivasi people never seen before. The lockdown seemed to have brought them to side, but then they couldn't go home like other people. They seem to have been working. And then nothing seemed to be working in their favor. The government was not responding. The Department of Fisheries were not responding. And so the paper began with what is going on over here. And
I think one of the things that we realized also was that because the workers are largely in their jetties, right? They're working in the jetties and then they're going out to sea. So their interaction and engagement with people on land is actually limited. So they are literally in many ways not visible in the same way that a lot of other migrant workers who work, say, for example, in the tourism industry might be. And it was only with the COVID pandemic that suddenly there were all these people who have been housed on boats, and we'll get into working conditions later, who are now suddenly visible as part of the economy of of labor of people who migrate to work for Goa. And I think this kind of sudden visibilization was something that was surprising for us, even though we've been working with fisheries and with fishing, with questions of fishing, as well as I think for other groups. And that's a sense that one was getting. So some of the questions that we started with, and I think it was literally more just trying to understand as opposed to any sense of wanting to do a paper or write something. It was literally just to understand how is it that Adivasi workers and Adivasi people are traveling all the way from Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, and are coming to Goa to work on these boats. What is the relationship of the economy that they come from, which are largely forest and resource economies, to fishing, which is also a traditional habitation, right? So where is this happening? How did it begin? And as we sort of started looking into some of these questions, again, we saw that there was a certain kind of absence. And there is this absence broadly in terms of migrant workers in the fishing industry. But we found a few papers as a category of the laborer in the marine fishing census. There are a few papers that have looked at migrant workers and migrant working conditions in fisheries, and say, for example, Gujarat and Veeraval, which is a very large, where a lot of trawl fishing is taking place. But there was nothing really, and also post-COVID organizations like Dakshin and collaborations that happened have also looked at giving recommendations. Sorry? It's an organization that had come up with a paper on policy, which is based in Bangalore as well, and they work around fishing. Okay, yeah. So there was different kinds of policy recommendations and things that were happening post-pandemic. But again, what we found was that there was really no mention of the Adivasi person as somebody who's engaged in this labor. And a lot of the literature is primarily around small-scale fisheries, right? So this imagination of a traditional occupation being carried out by non-traditional communities was something that we wanted to start looking at. So that was one part of it. So the two kind of things that and I think what happened was that because we were writing it during pandemic, we didn't want to go back to do interviews with the workers, even though we had numbers, because it absolutely didn't feel ethical and right. So we decided to start trying to look at different kinds of literatures to locate them. And part of it was a move towards the past. So to look historically, to understand if there are any precedents for this kind of move. And because we've also been working with organizations that have been working in Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, there was a sense of understanding that people have been migrating for work historically, right? Not just now, but since the British and before that probably as well. So some of the two main questions that we decided to look at were, and it's taken us a long time now to come to these questions. We've discarded lots of questions, picked up other questions. So the questions were under what conditions have Adivasi people come to be fishers in Goa, specifically in Goa, and secondly, what is this journey of the person, of the Adivasi person? What does it tell us about what's happening in the forests and also what's happening in the coast, right? What is the connection between these two very different geographies that we usually don't try and think together about? And specifically this paper now is looking at conditions in Goa. So I'm going to shift, and Siddharth's going to tell you a little bit about what does it mean to consider the fishing industry as a capitalist industry. And how we started thinking through that and what this relationship of the Adivasi worker tells us about how the industry of fisheries itself is framed.
So I'm going to put a timer here because I can get very nerdy about this. So I should keep tab on time. So
also, guys, 1 second.
Yes.
Both of us speak really fast. I know I do. So if at any point of time it's getting too quick, raise your hand, say something. Yeah.
Yeah. And for people who come in later, we've just started. We're just like starting out working now, so you haven't missed anything. But so the sense was that, we usually, or both of us, come from working with traditional fish worker unions. We've been involved with some of the national networks, more regional kind of. I do work in West Bengal. Ishita does work in Gujarat. And so a lot of our questions were about small scaleness, about tradition, about traditional and historic occupations. What the Adivasi person did in their presence in the fishing industry was to change that perspective a little bit for us. One, as somebody in terms of being from a non-fishing community, so the question of Adivasi or identity in fishing. And the second was that they were clearly not there other than for a wage. And so the fact that somebody was coming in as a waged worker also made us want to look as a very deliberate strategy at what is the capital side of it. Because if there's a wage, there's got to be capital. And so that is where the paper kind of took us a little bit away from other literature, drawing again on a lot of other work that has been done, but not so much in fishing. So we then took some of that work and kind of tried to think through about what does this tell us about the fishing industry. And so by understanding it in that way, we kind of then explored some of the other literatures that exist. And some of that is one, that fishing doesn't exist in an empty space in the ocean. It's very much defined by the ecology of where that fishery operates. The second is that it's not an empty space devoid of law and regulation, that it's bordered and bound up in all kinds of ways of management. And so when capital interacts with that ecology and with that management, it creates certain conditions to compete and be successful. And so then we try to look at what that competition is in the Goan context, and then try and think about the strategies of capital that comes up and creates this kind of conditions for the Adivasi worker to come in. So very briefly to kind of go into that, so that's on the right is the southwest coast of India. And if you see, I mean, I'm just going to point it out here very briefly. This is where Karwar and Mangalore and then Goa is. And then it kind of starts fanning out towards Gujarat. And so the continental shelf is quite narrow, closer to the southwest coast, and it gets broader towards the northern part of the coastline. And that changes what kind of fish are available and what kind of fishing gear operates. So until South Maharashtra, where the continental shelf is quite narrow, you have these upwelling currents, you have a lot of the continental shelf that brings up nutrients, and you have a kind of fish spawning, or the largest amount known as pelagic fish, which are essentially fish that live close to the surface. They're surface-dwelling fish. They're in big schools. Sardines and mackerels would probably be the most common that we are familiar with. And then if you go further north, there's a lot of continental shelf that can be trawled. So you have these trawling gears which work on the bottom and catch what are known as demersal or bottom-dwelling species, starting out as prawns and then diversified into other kind of things. We are not biologists, so it's not a very accurate description, but there is this clear distinction. If you look at fishery census, if you look at government data on what are the landings of different kinds of fish, what families they belong to, and what kinds of gear operate from there. So that was one thing. And then what we looked at was the fishery in itself. So just for example, this is a 20-year timeline of the two main species of Goa's fishery. One is sardines and one is mackerel. And if you look at the mackerel, especially the sardine, the orange line, you'll see that there's like this huge variation that happens all the time. So, there's booms and busts that continuously happen. So the fish will come back. Some year they won't come back in the same numbers. Sometimes they come back half to the numbers that were previously there. And so in this pursuit of bringing back fish for the market, there's this like variation that shows up in the fishery in itself. And last year when we were in Goa, it's been a very bad monsoon last year. It was a very hot summer last year. And there was this huge, like people were calling it a famine. Like there were people saying, we haven't seen this kind of famine in the sea before, which means that when the numbers come out, we're probably going to see like a big dip. So that's the other thing that happens. There's a very particular kind of fishery, and then it's subject to these variations. And the fish are also not, because of the conditions, in the same area. In some parts of the time, they're very close to the shore. Sometimes they go away. So fishing trips can't be standard. They're not like we're going to go out and get fish. Sometimes the fish are off the coast of Goa. Sometimes the boats are going to Ratnagiri. Sometimes they're going to Kerala. Some days they're going for 14 days, sometimes for 6 days. So, it all changes. And this is the cycle that exists through the day. The second part is the bordering, of course. Now, we think about the sea as being an open space. And, there's recently been work that has been done on the legality of, the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, the exclusive economic zones that kind of developed under that in the 80s. That's when India kind of claimed the EEZ in the late 70s. And constitutionally, fisheries management up to 12 nautical miles, which is about 20 kilometers, is in the state jurisdiction. And then from 20 to 200 miles, which is this white line between the red and the white, kind of is in the central government. So, as fisheries have expanded, the boats from Goa would kind of, initially would have just been in the red line. So completely under Goa's control. In fact, the fish that they catch now used to be caught by the rampons, which is the shore scene. And that's how the Goan surname, Ramponkar, or the traditional fisher, Ramponkar, comes. And that is in Karwar and all of that in Karnataka as well. But as the boats have kind of expanded out, they've kind of moved out from the red space into this white bordered space. And that is in the central jurisdiction. But in India, currently, there is no law that regulates that. So the both still kind of have a state jurisdiction. Once they go out, nobody's really looking at them. But also they follow the fish across boundaries. So there's no way. And this image roughly shows it. So if you look at Goa as that small little place in the middle, you'll see boats from Kerala, Karnataka, all into Goa's waters. And you'll see the Goan boats, which are the blue dots, going up to Ratnagiri and out there, and then coming out in front of Mangalore, Malpe, and some of those areas. So the boats really are not, Goan boats are not fishing in Goa. They're fishing all over and even further. So the other thing was then, the fishing trips and the strategies are in a space where the boat is continuously transcending boundaries. And there's work on this in the international sense. A ship flagged to Panama is fishing in Africa and it's going through the waters of Togo, Benin, Ghana, it's just crossing boundaries. And it becomes kind of this entity that is lawless, but over law, like there's a lot of law at the same time. And we kind of use that logic to think about how it plays out within Indian EEZ as well, to kind of think about whose regulation, why arrests happen, why these fights between fishers happen. And so kind of like that was the other thing that we thought about. And finally, then we were like, okay, so there's the coast that creates a very particular kind of fishery. And the fishery, what you're seeing here, these are the boats of Goa. This is a purse seine boat. So the shores, a seine is a type of net, and purse is literally pursing. So you have these pelagic schools of fishes. The boat spots the fish and it goes around them, or it'll drop a boat which goes around the big boat with a net. That's a vertical wall. And then they purse it at the bottom. And that kind of encircles the surface fish, which then the net is pulled on board, and then the fish is directly transferred into the ice and brought back. And this can go on for quite a while. So that's the pelagic fish. Again, booms and busts, not sure where the fish is found, competition from other states. And so then we looked at, okay, all of these are factors that are shaping the workers' lives on board. And just to give you a sense of how that looks. Now, this is a boat in the jetty, but this is what the crew would end up doing 3 times a day. So what they're doing on the jetty is like labor that happens 3 times a day. So just to give you, so these are the floats which are at the top, and then the net is, so it can be about 40, 50, 100 meters deep, and it can be about 3 to 4 kilometers long, 1.5 to, depends on each boat. And all of this is manually pulled. So what they're doing is they've offloaded the net, repaired it, and then they're loading it back out to go ship. And so this essentially happens 3 times a day. There's this continuous cycle of work. All of it is manually done. So one of the things that then struck us was that, there is this number of times the net has to be thrown out, has to be done manually. It requires a workforce that is much bigger than other kinds of boats. So trawlers of this size will have 10 or 11 people on board. But usually when it's purse seine boats, it's much bigger. There'll be up to 40 people on board. And so that's what then helped us contextualize, okay, this is the working conditions of where the workers come from. And Goa's fishery specifically needs these number of people. And they happen to be Adivasi people. Why we'll explore, yeah.
So we're going to go back and forth a little bit. And I think part of setting this context is to, so part of setting this context is to talk about what are the different kinds of systems that fisheries is interacting with. If capital is framing it, state borders are framing it, borders in the ocean that are often not visible to us are also framing it. So these are all different dynamics that is then influencing the worker who's working on the boat. And so just notice the music, right? I'm going to play this video again. When we get but basically, I mean, across the harbor, right, there's Nagpuriya music playing. And Nagpuriya music is music that's found in the entire Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand. And everywhere in the Goa and jetty, people are pulling their nets to this music. And of course, when they saw that we were filming, everyone started pulling it out. But essentially what happened was that initially when the lockdown had taken place in 2021, the people who were involved in the relief efforts had collected lists of members of the crew of who was working on the boat. So when we started looking at these lists, and there were like hundreds of names, right, running into multiple people, we started we started mapping them on Google Maps to see which district they are coming from. And I think what became, which was startling for me, was, and I think for in general, was that they were all coming from districts that were in central India, number one. Number two, that these are all areas that are close to each other. These are contiguous districts. So they came from Chhattisgarh, from Jharkhand, from Orissa, from West Bengal, right? And these are all different states. So they were different Adivasi communities. So the lists had names of people. It had the district they were coming from, the village, and also and not the community, but numbers. And none of these numbers worked because we tried getting in touch with them later. And I think what it really did was that it kind of brought out a slightly different geography of central India, as opposed to the one that we see currently, which looks at state borders and that is divided across state border lines, right? And it is also a historical geography. It's the geography of the Santhal Paraganas. It's where the Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act took place. It's the geography of the rebellions that have happened, the Birsa Munda rebellion, of the Chua rebellion, and all of these have influenced these forest regions in multiple different ways. And I think that kind of this sort of identity of what is labor on these boats was hidden, right? Because if you look at migration census, you look at data is divided on, if at all it exists, it's divided at a state level, right? But actually that data hides, right? That data of state level hides the community identity in some senses of people who are actually Adivasis. So Jharkhand, so we started exploring a little bit. And also there's a whole history of expulsion. There's a history of how the material basis of this place through different kinds has been sort of deteriorating, which has led people to migrate outward, right? So interestingly, the connection of agrarian and forest communities going to sea is not recent. There is a whole history of indentured labor of coolies who have traveled from these forest regions to different paths through the sea. So that relationship between the land and sea, while it felt new, is actually not. It has a historical basis as well. So essentially, I think, so this is actually an old map of the Southwest frontier. And we've superimposed the district areas. So Chhattisgarh, Orissa, Jharkhand are the green and the blue and the red lines. And as you can see, these are all areas that actually fall within the what used to be the Southwest Frontier Agency. It is also a forest area. So you can see through the green patch. And this is actually one of the older maps. It's very hard to find maps that are accurate in some cases. And we sort of overlaid current district borders on the older map just to make it a bit simpler. Yeah, so these are the districts. So these are the states that the workers were coming from. And I think it's a bit unclear, but basically, so when we went, but yeah, so Simdega, Sundargarh, Jharsuguda are people where Jashpur are all close to each other at the border. And that's where the people that we met were coming from. And we went back to Goa in 2024 to conduct interviews with the people. Now, post-independence, these districts were divided into different states, which is also one of the reasons why it was difficult for us to find information. And I think it kind of also influences how we calculate harms, right? Intergenerational harm, community-based harm. And I think what it did was really focus attention on this question of identity and also on communities. How do we think of labor as coming from specific communities? Does that change the way we look at the conditions at sea? Now, again, we won't go into detail here, but I think it's also that there's a certain, as we saw in COVID, people wanted to go back to their home regions. And one of the reasons for that was that rather than the space of work, it's home that provides care, it's home that provides security. And we've sort of used what's called like social reproduction literature in the paper, but essentially one of the points that was becoming clear was that the reason they're able to work for depressed wages is because they're taken care of, right? They have land, they have systems of community kinship and care, which allows people to actually migrate. And as like a lot of other migration literature also tells you, seasonal migration is how people are making their homes, are sustaining their homes. So there is large amounts of seasonal migration that's happening from these regions as well. So when we went back for our interviews, we sort of went and did like a series of interviews in two places, which is the Malim Jetty and the Karbona Jetty in North Goa and in South Goa. We had short conversations with Adivasi workers, and we also had conversations with boat captains, and we'll get into that a little bit, but essentially the boat captains were called Pagi had a lot more leisure time to talk to us. So we could sit down and have tea with them. With Adivasi workers, it was we had to literally, there were like these small, short conversations we were having at different points of time because they kept being called back to work, right? There was no space for leisure. And we'll get into kind of how we analyze that a little later. So people were largely from Simdega, Sundargarh, Kunti, Gumla. And in the paper, we focus specifically on Simdega and
Sundar.
And Sundargarh, yeah. So a lot of them had either 1 to 10 hectares of land, either with papers or without papers in the hilly areas of these regions. They were migrating for different reasons. A lot of people that we met were migrating for the first time. And one of the things that struck us was that for them, migration was something that was decided collectively. It's not an individual decision. Families are deciding, mothers are telling their sons, go migrate because there's nothing left to do here, right? The other thing that was coming out was that people were migrating because they needed cash. So everyone was like, खाने के लिए पैसे हैं हमारे पास. खाने के लिए, they grow paddy, right? So they grow paddy, they grow groundnuts, they grow almonds. So there's enough for sustenance. But actually what they're migrating for is because without cash, life is no longer possible, right? So what is cash needed for? Cash is needed for health. Cash was needed for education. Cash was needed for constructing a house. And if you think about it, a lot of these kind of issues are also issues that states are rescinding responsibility from, right? Because there is no provision of education, of health. You need cash because people are going into debt. The other thing was that actually cash is now being needed for agrarian, for their farming as well. A lot of these areas, there's paddy farming, and they kept saying that there's absolutely no rains. So climate change kind of also kept coming up. In the last couple of years, they were saying that there's been very limited rain. So their paddy, they have not been able to grow as much, which means that that became one of the other reasons. But they also need cash for renting a tractor, for example, or for buying seeds, right? So that cash economy has become part of the agrarian system there. Yeah. And then the other thing that we were told was that post-COVID, there are buses that have started coming to get workers, right? And these workers are being got by the boat owners from their areas, or they're coming by train. And I think so, and I think what was important for us in some senses was two things. Number one, to think about how the relationship between these two places is being constituted actually through the movement of these people, right? So there are some geographers who've been talking about how a place is not constructed is always constructed, it's always open, things are always dynamic, things are always in movement. And here we could see how the movement of these workers, of Adivasi people into these different geographies is what is making and sustaining fisheries. And so we started then exploring what are the conditions of work that are taking place in these fish boats and jetties here. And I think the other thing is that I think we might have written a different paper if we had gone to do our interviews in Jharsuguda, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, right? Because what we decided for now that because our focus was kind of looking at the marine fisheries industry, we went back to Goa. But there's still so many questions that we don't have answers to, and so many other explorations within the same framework.
Okay. So, I mean, because the paper started with like thinking of capital and labor, and then we started thinking about the Adivasi identity. One of the things that happened with literature, again, like political economy literature or literature that looks at that lens, was there was this addition of caste onto class. There was this addition like, there's class and then there's caste that gets added into it in the South. And we were not very happy with that. We wanted to kind of bring caste to the center of looking at why work is structured the way it is. And so with like rounds of visits and what was happening, also, this, because very clearly in the pandemic, as I was saying, people kept working. So there was a devaluation of their life and safety right then by making them work, then extending their fishing season, not making provisions for them to go back. The state was unmoved. The Goan society was unmoved. A lot of people lost interest in relief work, initially. And there was this like complete sense that, the Goan society or their place in Goa is to come work at sea and leave without anything being taken or being given to them from this area. And the second thing during the interviews was also that what we discovered was that, there was this continual sense of the people being not from Goa and being there of an inferior kind in the words and motives of the people. And so we then kind of, just to look at this, what was very clear was that the capital or the boat owners and operators were all from Goa. Not only were they from Goa, they were from upper caste and general category groups of Goa. So Khadvi community, which historically the Ramponkars are also from, but they are also Janeo wearing. They have the EWS now in Goa, and they can be quite identifying as forward caste. and general category. So obviously ownership is right up there. Then the vessel captains, almost all of them come from Karnataka, from Pagi, Ambika communities, which themselves from river-based fisheries have moved to the coast and moved up as workers in the 90s and have kind of, as Goans moved out, have become the vessel captains. Also, some of the people from Andhra, from fishing communities coming, they fall into the OBC category. So they were on there. Below them were vessel crew, and this vessel crew was from their caste and kin groups, facilitated by the captains. So the captains will be 50, 60 saying, I'm in the sunset of my career, but here are 10 boys from my village who have started coming and I've trained them to be captains. One of the people who we had actually helped go home during COVID has now become a boat owner as an Andhra fisher. And he has a room there. He rides a motorcycle. He doesn't go fishing really. So we met him because he was like, Kal mera, tomorrow my boat is coming. Come, we'll sit. And he spoke to us for 2-3 hours, took us to the boat, and he was like, yeah, now these boys go. You had helped them with their tickets and all. Now they're captains. So there's also that kind of thing, but they are slightly lower on the category. And then you have the vessel workers. And the reason they're called workers is because nobody in Goa referred to Adivasi people as fishers. To the point where if we asked people that where do the fishers come from, they'll say they come from Karnataka or they'll come from Andhra. You're like, no, the Adivasi people. They'll say, oh, they are the net pullers. Jal tanne wale hain wo. So even referring to them as fishers was not considered in the vocabulary. And so we clearly realized that, there's a clear hierarchy. The hierarchy is not based on merit or on one's skills or on one's capacity. It's based on identity. And so then it became very clear to us that what we are looking at here is a microcosm of the caste system at sea. And we kind of like went down looking at Dr. Ambedkar's work at sea and kind of extending that framing into the sea. And of course, two of the most popular things that have been applied in understanding labor is, the caste system is not a division of labor, it's a division of laborers. And so even with the vessel captains, it's very important to kind of remind that they are OBC, they are productive in what Kanchaila, I would say that they generate and are productive castes, not kind of parasitic upper caste, Brahmin caste, etc. So, but then within the laborers also, there is a division about there being a certain affiliation to owners, and then the Adivasis being a rung lower than the traditional people who have been coming to Goa. And then, of course, there was not just economic, right? It was not just that we get a higher wage, you get a lower wage. There was an attitude of contempt that, again, is well captured by Dr. Ambedkar in saying that, there's an ascending kind of hatred and a descending scale of contempt. And so using these as understandings that we knew about, but then when we went and spoke to the people, it became quite clear that this applies very clearly. And, we began to look at this in 4 ways mainly, which we'll briefly explore.
A lot of the literature, right, that looks at labor is in terms of class. And I think what we found was that specific groups of people are doing specific kinds of work. So you have like Siddharth was explaining, you have Pagis from Andhra, from Karnataka, you have Adivasi workers, and the sort of the propagation of that work is happening within their own kinship and community networks, right? So the question of merit takes place very differently, which is why I think to us, this idea of classes of labor was not adequate in explaining what was happening. And that's when sort of this idea of graded inequality, I think, has become quite fundamental to how we think through this. And I think so when we went there, I think one of the questions initially in our initial draft was, what does it mean, right? Because this was actually a small section. But then when we went back to do our interviews, this question of what is the materiality of caste? What does it look like, right? What are the things that shows up as material practices? And I think that kind of became very clear when we went back and we spent some time in Goa again. So when we were thinking about it, we thought of it in like 4 separate ways. Number one was the distribution of profit, right? So 20% of the profit is always going to the top of the triangle.
Yeah.
Right? So the vessel owners, operators, and then the vessel captains, the crew members are getting a monthly wage. So one of the questions might be, why are people coming, right? Why are Adivasi workers coming? They're coming because they're getting 10 to 12,000 rupees a month, which they're getting as a lump sum. And we get into this in the end a little bit. But they're essentially, so irrespective of profits, irrespective of whether you catch a lot of fish or less fish, the Adivasi workers are getting a same amount. Whereas for the vessel crew and for the owner operators, it's dependent on catch, which means that there's a lot more fluctuation, right? And there's also more profit.
And if there is a bumper catch,
yeah,
the share accrues to the upper people. And if there is a loss, then the wages get suppressed and the losses reduced. So it's also to say that we'll safeguard our profits from the fishery.
Yeah.
Let the workers do the work and get a fixed
It's a
wage.
standard fare. And who is, and then the question again comes, right? Because there's a lot of work on how within the way that labor migration is structured, certain kinds of opportunities are available to certain kinds of groups, right? So for example, who does manual scavenging? Will OBC communities or Brahmin communities do manual scavenging? No, right? So similarly, in a sense here, there are particular kinds of work that are being done by particular kinds of people in particular kinds of bodies. And I think that kind of kept coming up in conversation as well. Secondly was that there was a very obvious division of board of accommodations, and there was a very specific spatial division on board. And I think that was kind of physically there. So there are around 30 Adivasi people. So if we go back to one of the pictures of the boats, right? So you see the bottom cabin and then you see the cabin on top, right? Yeah, so this one and then the top one. So now the 4 people, which is the vessel crew and the vessel captain, 4 of them are staying in the bottom floor. 30 to 40 Adivasi workers are in the top, right? So you see the kind of space that is being given to people. What is it a reflection of, right? Is a question that I think we have to ask ourselves, right? Is it just about class, right? Is it about, what is this about? And what is it that allows for certain kinds of people to be put in certain conditions, right? I think these are questions that we have to think through. And for us, here the answer is cast, maybe in a different place it's something else. So there are 30 to 40 people who are sleeping and living for those 5 to 6 to 7 days that they are going out to sea on the cabin on top. A lot of them, when it's not raining, they sleep outside on the boat. Water is rationed. They're given 3 to 4 buckets of water to bathe, get ready. The other things, 3 to 4 buckets per week. Yeah, so when they come back to board, they're there for, like, say, for example, 12 hours. So they're given a certain amount of water, and even on, because see, again, so on the boat, right? Yeah, you have ice. Ice is a fixed expense, right? Water, food, these are all fixed expenses. The only expense that's loose is wages. That's the one that you can mediate. That's the one that can be changed around. And we'll explain this a little better later. And then the third thing that really came up in our conversations was the possibility of skilling, right? So there was somebody who's an Adivasi person who told us that he's an engineer, but he was not even allowed to go into the engine boat. And they were told that you people can't do this kind of work, right? So irrespective of your qualifications, irrespective of years of experience, we met people who'd been coming fishing, very few, but there were a few people who'd been coming for almost 10 years. But there was absolutely no sense of promotion, upskilling, upgradation that was possible. Again, the question is why, right? And I think it relates back to what Siddharth was saying that there are already people that the Pagis had knew that there were 10 people from their village who were from their same caste community who were going to come and take their place. That place was not available to somebody else. Thirdly, I think, and that's why sort of Dr. Ambedkar's quote, I think it just really kept coming back to us, was that there was a very clear kind of sense of saying that they are net pullers, they are not fish workers. And also that there was a certain devaluation. So somebody told us that it's only the hard bodies, right? It's only the hard bodies of the Adivasi person that can do this kind of labor for this kind of pay. So we met other dock workers, for example, who are again from obviously probably Dalit communities who are getting 30,000 rupees a month to offload trucks, right? The Adivasi workers for more work, harder conditions are getting 10 to 12,000 rupees. So there is a certain relativity to even the way in which labor, what kind of labor, who does that labor, and who is paid how much for that labor. You know, there's a certain framework in which these conversations are taking place. And I think these became very important to us. And I think part of the effort with this paper has been, how do you situate these questions, right, into the study of capitalism? How do you situate these questions into the study of the oceans, right? And I think that's kind of the move that we have been successfully and unsuccessfully been trying to make. And also there was a sense that the Adivasi person is not integrated into the modern capitalist economy. So a lot of the shopkeepers, you know, they're like, they don't know how to function in this society. They're gullible. So a lot of these kind of attitudes also were coming to us in our interviews from different people who were part of this economy.
Yeah, almost this childlike thing, like the labor contractors will be like, you know, we can't speak to them rudely after they have a drink because then they'll just get on a train and go home.
Yeah.
You know, so we have to handle them with care. But at the same time, there's a continuous herding back of people to the boat. Also, I mean,
Yeah.
just the last, the work is relentless.
Yeah.
So they put that net out 3 times or 4 times a day, manually pull it up, sort the fish, put it into the boat,
Yeah.
bring it
6,
back.
7 hours of work.
They offload the fish, they turn the net, repair it, they load ice, they load water, they just buy rations. And within 12 hours, the boat is back out at sea. And this goes on for 10 months every single day. It's just endless.
And
So
also,
there's also like this thing that all of the Adivasis' time is our time
Yeah.
when they are in Goa.
so it's, like usually you think that, okay, I'm doing labor and I'm getting a wage in turn, but actually it's not labor that's been sold or been captured, right? It's actually the time of the Adivasi people. It is the bodies of the Adivasi people that has been captured because they have no other space that is outside. So when we were there, like for example, Ganesh Chaturthi was going on. The Pagis and all the owners, they all went back to their villages. The workers, Adivasi workers, were put in the boat and moored in between the Panji River, right? And they were just there during that time. So again, right, this question, so it's not just labor, something else is going on, right? Yeah,
Were they paid? They were not.
they are paid that 10 to 12,000 rupees.
No, the Ganesh Chaturthi. During Ganesh Chaturthi.
Yeah. But they were basically kept on the boat the whole time. So they are paid a fixed sum. So irrespective of whether the boat is going out to sea or it's going out to sea more, they are being paid that sum. But of course,
And
Yeah.
Goa displayed a lot of wage theft
Yeah.
during during pandemic. So
during
there is also this thing that nobody's paid monthly. So at the
Yeah.
end of the year, 10,000 accrues into 10 months of work and 1 lakh will be sent.
Yeah.
But a lot of people we met,
Yeah.
including some captains, said that in Goa, wages are regularly, there is threat of
there has
violence.
been- yeah.
People are not allowed to forget unionizing. Any voice to ask wages, like just leave the work and go. And so a lot of people are actually not going back to Goa, which is one of the things we realized.
Yeah.
That there's a lot of movement out of Goa.
And that's, one of
And
the
that's-
places, we
yeah.
were meeting a lot of young people when we went. So they were like literally anywhere from 14, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. There were very few older people.
Yeah.
And that's because a lot of them were coming for the first time. And one of the reasons could have been that wages were withheld last time. So people refused to come back.
And when you say people refuse to come back, is there like a comparative, like, oh, Karnataka is better or something? Or,
Yeah.
it is comparatively less in Goa was worse.
I mean, so we'll talk a little bit about this because Siddharth's fieldwork right now is in Karnataka. And actually that helped give us a sense that the conditions in Goa are specific to some degree. And I think what it also, and generally also being there talking to people, what it kind of really made us think about is that labor is like, people are dynamic, labor is dynamic, people are constantly making choices, right? So they're coming to Goa, they're saying, okay, work conditions are shitty, we are not getting paid. They are saying, let's look elsewhere, right? What is close by? Karnataka is close by, Malpe is like close by. So let's go there. So there are choices within all of this, there are choices that are being made. And that this movement of labor. So this actually might be a snapshot in time in some senses, but actually there is dynamism, there is circulation. People are making choices about where they'll find better wages, where they'll find better conditions, right? So I think is also really important. And what it also, I think, made us think about was the fact that somewhere we need to kind of look at some of these processes regionally. So if we're looking at Goa, for example, the broader sort of network between Karnataka, Goa, Maharashtra, actually as a space of analysis is really interesting because there is movement of people. And centering that movement of people actually, I think, makes us think better when we analyze particular conditions as opposed to coming at it from certain kinds of either administrative or state categories that we have been taught to think with, right? So what this paper in some senses did for us was that centering the worker opened up all these different kinds of territorial configurations. It opened up the forest as a space of study. It opened up the regional dynamics of the coast as a space of study. And within these borders are somewhat superfluous, right? They are impediments, they are barriers, but they are also being constantly crossed. And I think that is a really interesting perspective to think through.
Yeah, I mean, we just put down some thoughts. We'll quickly walk through that and then we'll stop. So one is that, there is this idea that not for people in this room, but, Goan fisheries is extremely profitable.
Yeah.
It's not that it's a fishery in decline. It's not that it's a petty trader trying to just get by. There's people with petrol pumps, hotels, ice plants who are investing, buying these boats. A per-scene boat costs 2.3 crores to build. So it's a big investment. Returns can be. So, some captains told us 1.5 crore if you make a year, you are like doing okay. So, it's big money in fisheries because we come from small scale and all.
Yeah.
This kind of sums is unthinkable for a small scale fishing
community. Costing like lakhs and lakhs, right?
So it's profitable. So it's definitely exploitation because there is an exploitable workforce, not because of anything. but it's also driven by those kind of conditions of the fishery in itself, boom, bust, kind of maximizing profit. So workers, because they are the only variable cost in that sense, do take on some of the biggest brunt. And this is about something about conservation, right? Like we think about nature as existing and to be saved, but it's actually the labor that transforms nature into a commodity for the markets. And that labor angle in studying natural resource communities is quite like not interesting, it's important, because that is where it opens up that kind of black box, as they say, of production, which is what is happening in the capital labor nature interface, especially in industries such as this. So that's one thing that opened it. What Ishita said about like, once you start following people, it opens up a lot more spaces of analysis, like the forests, the coasts, the regional dynamics, rather than just looking at the boat or the workplace in itself. There's a lot more that's structuring it. Cross borders. So, districts are across borders, identities are across borders, and people move across borders. So a lot of this absence is also because there is no way to capture it in state censuses. Like, so if you think about Odisha, in our imaginations, Odisha data, you'll find a lot of data that's even at the district level, but at the village level, how many people, you don't find it. And I'm not saying data is the answer to solve this, but just looking at it makes you think differently about those regions.
I mean, I think other thing that I think we were thinking about constantly here was actually, what does data do, right? What is data telling us? What is the data that's present telling us? What is it not telling us? What is it hiding? And I think approaching the kinds of reams of information from that perspective was really important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Finally, with caste, but also like land-based processes, going out to sea.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of work that thinks of the sea as being an empty space, as being kind of completely flat, as being devoid of a lot of its history. But the history of the sea is very violent. I mean, chattel slavery, indentured labor, of course, but even today, the ocean as a space of emptiness has a lot of labor that's, quite harsh in that sense. But at the same time, the sea is also a space where workers are coming with agency, and compared to a lot of other occupations, fisheries is at the higher end of the spectrum of where Adivasi workers are earning.
Yeah.
So it also then puts you into this dilemma of, there is that question and tension between the two. And then there's the question of course, small scale fishers. Where do they fit into this solidarities, contradictions, and, industrial fisheries? So the Adivasi question, clashes with the small scale coastal rights, our kind of mother sea questions that we have. And finally, I think we thought that thinking of caste in fisheries is important because there's such a dearth of literature on it. Just after the tsunami, there's some work on Dalits in the tsunami post-rehabilitation work, some work from Odisha where there are like scheduled caste communities in Odisha and West Bengal. But beyond that, you don't really hear about caste in fisheries and how it's structured work. This, of course, is an extreme example because of the distinction of who's coming to work and who owns the boats. But I think it alludes to the fact that there is a lot more to be done in terms of consciousness of what's happening at sea. Yeah.
Yeah. You can stop there and then open up for questions. Thanks, guys.
I have one question. You speak about the forest economy and the coastal economy in the paper. Why is it important when you're saying that the data hides the community identity? And when you talked about how Adivasis are looked at as uncivilized or whatever in that, why is it important for that identity to be remembered? Can you tell us a little more about the identity, about that forest economy, where they're coming from?
Yeah. So again, as I was saying, I think there was a certain point of time when we were writing the paper when we had to make a decision as to where we focus our analysis. And we decided to kind of look at it because both of us were coming from a space where we wanted to look at the sea as a space, and look at fishing as an economy. But I think what became important was, just in context of that, was that there is a process of dispossession that's been taking place in these forest economies. So basically these areas of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha, right? These are all forest regions, but there have been few specific processes that have been taking place over time. Post the British, they've been coming within a certain kind of administration. There has post-independence been, I mean, we've heard a lot about the kind of development based dispossession and displacement of Adivasi communities that has happened, right? So there are certain processes essentially that are taking place in these regions that are leading people to move. Why? is why are their livelihoods, be they agrarian, and which is a mix of agrarian and use of forest resources, why are they not sustainable anymore? And this sustainability is not a recent question. I think you can trace it all the way back to the British, right? You can trace it back, but at the same time, there has been a slow expulsion of people. So if you look at tea estates, for example, in West Bengal, Assam, who are the people working in those tea estates? If you look at tea estates in, say, for example, even Kerala,
Kerala, no.
it's all Adivasi people, right? Who are working in these areas. Why are they working? People have, so even the people that we met and what I've seen in the work that I've been doing, that I have done in the past in the Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand area has been largely with Adivasi communities. There is a strong sense of tradition. There is a strong sense of connection with the land, but people do leave these, right? And they travel to different places to work. Now, again, this is not to say that there is only dispossession, there is only violence, and hence people are moving. But there are processes that have been taken place because these are regions that are also extremely rich in natural resources, right? So there are two kinds of main things that we were seeing. Number one is that there are areas where there is large-scale mining, where there is industrialization. These are originally Adivasi areas, which are also areas which have mineral resources, for example, right? So there's one process whereby people are being displaced because of the kind of mining that's happening, because of industrial development, steel plants, etc. Number two is the fact that the agrarian and the forest livelihood. So both actually Jharsuguda and Sundargarh, they are areas with the highest forest cover and the highest Adivasi
Yeah, the
populations.
scheduled areas.
And they are areas with some of the highest migration in the country as well, right? So the question is, why are these three processes overlapping, right? And one of the things that, again, we were seeing is that it's because there is a certain way in which it's not enough to farm, it's not enough to live off forest resources. Secondly, that other kinds of facilities that could have made up. For example, education. Why do people move, right? People move because they want to construct a house. And this is what we were hearing in this kind of the history. Like, people move because they're going into debt because they can't afford healthcare. Public government services don't work, right? You go to the hospital once. Health is actually one of the highest reasons for people to go into debt in the country, right? People are moving because they want to educate their children. So many of the people, the Adivasi people we met, were like, "बच्चों को पढ़ाना है, इसलिए हम जा रहे हैं." We have enough to eat, right? Because in these specific areas, specifically Sundargarh and Simdaga, there's still farming that's happening. These are not areas in which like there's high amount of mining, but because of the kind of introduction of seeds, because of lack of rains, because the
Lack of
cost
irrigation, general
yeah,
devaluation of agriculture.
costs of agriculture have become high, right? So that for that also they're needing cash. So this question of this cash economy, I think that's also really important. And that's actually maybe, I mean, we haven't done as much work as we would have liked on it. So those are some of the kind of reasons. And yeah, and the lack of irrigation is the other thing that people were saying. That because there is no irrigation facilities, these are also areas where literally the state does not often operate, right? These are areas where there's very limited presence of state in many ways. In some ways it's good, in some ways it's bad also, right? Does that answer some of your question, Aishwarya?
She got busy.
She says. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a few questions.
Like, how do economic?
Sorry,
Can
one
we
second.
just finish with her and then come to you?
Maybe we can take 2-3 questions. If they're similar, then we might be able to respond to them also. Yeah.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
So you spoke a lot about how in this hierarchy on the board, there seems to be a very caste and region nexus. So there are a lot of the Adivasi workers are from Central India, while the boat captains are from OBC communities, but specifically from Karnataka and Andhra.
Yeah.
While a lot of boat owners were Goan. So did you see also like the kind of shift in like region in the sense other Adivasi people from Karnataka and Andhra who work as labor on the boat, or do you have upper caste people from Central India who work as captains, and or is it very clearly region and caste?
Should we take one more? Should we answer? We
We
take
can,
one more question.
yeah, maybe. We'll just write
You
it
want to
down.
go next?
Yeah, so how do economic factors affect these conditions in the lands that they are living in traditionally? And like what are the factors which are affecting the living conditions in the boats which they are living in the segregation between the classes? Are they leading to what do you say conflicts between them? And there's this wide gap of communication between these communities and the general public as we are right now. And how do we curb this word of communication to actually address these issues?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Unless somebody has asked any questions.
No, I'll do this. You can.
Right.
You
Yeah,
can.
and there was a third.